Who's joined us?
We have a pretty full house. Jimmy Newton, Canis, Margaret Rose, Randy and Rhonda Reeves, and Steve.
All right, very good. Greetings to all of you this morning. If you have a comment or something, Melody can grab it and you can enter into class with us. Today is the last day of the quarter, so this is my last Sunday with you. It took a long time for me to get here. This is the only class from the middle school on up through adults that I have never taught before until this semester or this quarter. So it's been good to be with you. Thank you for being able to enjoy the time together and to grow. It's very interesting to me how life unfolds. Anybody ever look back at your life and looked at how life unfolded for you and you're kind of surprised by it? Growing up in Virginia, I never imagined that I would live in Texas, let alone Lubbock. In fact, the first time that I even knew really anything about Lubbock. Does Jim need help again?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to have to get one of the teenagers.
I got it. He's in some Greek or something here.
That'll be foreign to all of us then. The first time I even knew much about Lubbock, we were living in Memphis, and I was just about to finish up my doctoral work, and Jana Stevenson came and said, "Hey, church where I grew up's looking for a preacher." No, that wasn't. That was later. First thing she said is they're looking for someone at LCU to teach in psychology. And I said, where's Lubbock? And then my second response was, who wants to live in Texas? Now,
We haven't fought in words.
yeah, and so I say that very, very cautiously this morning. But the reason I said it was this. My perception is that Texas had plenty of spiritual resources. Texas didn't need me to come to Texas. But other places I lived did have that need. So I didn't have anything, but life has unfolded now that we've lived in Texas now for more than 25 years. So life unfolds in interesting ways. And the neat thing is that God can use you wherever you are. And I think that's what we have to remember, because we don't always find ourselves in the place where we want to be. Maybe. And maybe we even kind of resent because of the way life is unfolding. We resent God a little bit for being where we are. But will we let Him use us wherever we are? And that's what we kind of see in Paul's life. So, as I spoke at a funeral this past week, I couldn't help but think of my mother, because her birthday was also last week. In fact, the funeral was on my mother's birthday. If she was still alive, she would be 91, but she's not. However, her influence is still strong in my life. Similarly, now that we have covered a portion of Paul's legacy, in a sentence or two, how would you describe the one who described himself as the least of the apostles? How would you describe him? That's his own description. How would you describe him? We kind of started this quarter with that. How would you describe him in light of what we've read?
I would describe him as one untimely called and sent.
That sounds almost biblical. Teresa. We put those words in the Bible. All right, someone untimely called and sent. All right, someone else. Strong. Okay, what else? Devoted.
I think he was extremely confident yet humble.
Extremely confident yet, wow, what a combination. That's a tough combination to come by.
Well-
Extremely confident but humble.
He knew where he came from.
Yeah. And he reminded his readers oftentimes of where he had come from. Someone else, how would you describe it? We use terms early on like passionate. And I will say he was always relentless and passionate. But he was transformed from legalistic persecutor to gracious disciple and disciple maker. Now, some of us in this room have traversed that ground before. We have gone from legalist to understanding the grace of God. And that is that's a hard road. And not many people make that very successfully. The Pharisees, many of them did not, most of them did not. We see Nicodemus, we see Joseph of Arimathea, the two who took the body of Jesus from the cross, being able to make that transition. But most people have a hard time making that transition. It was through Paul's brokenness that God perfected him and made him useful. Now, what does that mean to you? When you think about it, it's through through Paul's brokenness that God transformed him and made him useful. What does that mean for you?
I think in one way, you can describe Jesus coming to earth, being incarnate, and being human and suffering and dying as a form of brokenness so that he could relate to us.
Yeah. When you give up God's status for human status, that's definitely a brokenness. What does that mean to you that it's through brokenness that Paul became useful, really useful for God? How many of you want to go through brokenness? No hands raised, right? Yet it is through brokenness that's how God often perfects us and makes us what he wants us to do. And I think sometimes, unless it's only through that brokenness that we come to really appreciate what grace is. Because as long as I don't see the need for it or I don't embrace it, it's hard for me to appreciate grace for what it is.
I think a lot of people that until the only thing they realize they have left is God won't reach for him.
Yeah. So, with those thoughts in mind about the character of Paul, let's talk about what he spent his life talking about, which is Jesus Christ. So turn to Philippians chapter 2. We're going to read verses 5 through 10. And then Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Somebody read the Philippians first.
Have this mind among you yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God, a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
All right, and then in Colossians chapter 1, 15 through 20, somebody read those verses, please.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
All right, Paul's greatest contribution to the ancient and modern world is a better understanding of Jesus Christ. What do we learn about Jesus from each of these passages? Now, what strikes you immediately when you compare these two passages? I hope it strikes you immediately. In Philippians, generally speaking, how is Jesus Christ depicted?
He became a man as a servant.
He's the head of the body of Christ.
Not in Philippians. Not in Philippians.
Okay.
In
The nature
Philippians,
of
He was
God
not
and the
equal to
image
God.
of God.
right? He's the image of God and he's God, but he did what?
Humbled himself.
Humbled himself, emptied himself. We see an emphasis on his lowliness. When you go to Colossians, that's very different. What strikes you there?
Every knee will bow.
Well, that's what the end of Philippians says.
The supremacy of Christ.
Colossians, Paul emphasizes the supremacy of Christ, the greatness of Christ, that he's over everything, that he created everything, that everything was created for him. Interesting, the contrast between those two. So going to Philippians 2 in particular, what stands out to you about the character and nature of Jesus Christ? All right, let me help us get started. One is, where was he? Right hand of God. In fact, he is the image, Colossians says, of the invisible God, but Paul says in Philippians that he is also God who emptied himself. So the first thing we learn about Jesus Christ is that he moved out of his comfort zone. Right?
He didn't think he was equal with God.
Okay? He didn't, and that's the second thing I wanted to mention. He didn't latch on to that.
He was humble.
Yeah. Rather than latching on to being God, he humbled himself and made himself nothing. What else do you see?
He was obedient to God.
He was obedient. In fact, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 says he learned obedience through suffering. Isn't that interesting language? Now, yeah, go ahead.
This may be a tangent if you don't want to chase, but I'm gonna throw it out there anyway. You know, at the beginning of this, in the NIV says in very nature God, and you know the other translations are basically the same, God. And then after this, he's at the right hand, like more of a son. And one of the things back when Jack Cummings was here said that he kind of has this theory in mind that what Jesus gave up, the equality, never quite reattained. You know, the sacrifice he gave up to be a man is, his position is forever a little different than what it was in the beginning. And he said, I don't know if that's true, and Kyle certainly doesn't know exactly if that's true, but there certainly seems to be something there. And if that's the case, you think about the sacrifice that Christ made to forever give up that true equality, and now it's a sonship and join heirs with us. That's truly a sacrifice.
Yeah, and that reveals again the character that he has to do that. Now, if you're asking me to comment on that, I don't know the answer to that either. I think part of what makes Scripture, the identity of the Godhead Trinity difficult to comprehend is that Jesus Christ in particular is talked about in a pre-incarnate state. What he was before he was born. I mean, 1 Corinthians 10 talks about him being the rock from which Israelites drew water. So he was on the scene and active even in human life before being born. Then we have, while he was on earth for the 33 years roughly that he was here, and then we have him post-incarnate. And so the Bible doesn't always clearly delineate which state he's being talked about. So it's sometimes, I think, hard to piece all that together. But I wouldn't argue with that. You know, I think it's significant.
But in, was it Matthew 28, he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. So I tend to think he's humble by choice.
Yeah,
In the midst of all authority. I mean, it kind of blows your mind. But.
Yeah. In fact, we're going to talk about the way that Paul presented Christ to the ultimate human authorities, and a little bit later in the lesson. And what does that mean in light of what we're talking about now? So good thoughts, good comments. Ultimately, God exalted him through his humility. God exalted him through his humility. We don't think that's the path, right? We usually don't think that the path to greatness is through humility, but that's what Scripture teaches. And that's what we see in the life of Jesus.
I'm talking about Paul. I mean, this brought this to mind in 2 Corinthians, where he talked about in his weakness is he made strong, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. In
Right.
2 Corinthians 12.
Right.
Yeah, my power is made perfect in weakness.
My power is made perfect in weakness. So that relates to us.
See, if I'm operating out of my strength, you can't see God's strength.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm operating out of my weakness, where there's no way I can get credit for anything, God gets all the glory. And Paul came to understand that, but I gather that it was a process for him to get there. It took him a while to get there, which it would for most of us. The Colossians 1 passage. What do you see? What do you see about the description there? How do we come to know God? How do we come to know the nature? Remember Moses? Moses had this burning bush experience with God, and God said, I'm going to use you to deliver the Israelites, and he had direct communication with God, went up on the mountain several times and had communication, spent lengthy periods of time with God in those situations. But Moses came away from that and said, I want to know you. I want to see you face to face. If you're going to ask me to lead these people, I want to know who I'm telling them about. And of course, you know that God said, okay, I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock, and I'm going to pass by you. You're not going to see my face, and we'll let you see the back of me. And he described himself. He said, I am compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love. And he described himself. God describes himself there. But I don't think Moses was probably satisfied.
Yeah.
I don't think he was satisfied with that. What does Jesus do that not even Moses got?
He's face to face. He was face to face with these people. He ate with these people. He walked with these people.
He's Emmanuel.
He's Emmanuel. He's God
Yeah,
with
with
us. If you want to see what God is like, or what God would be like in flesh, you get to see it because there's God in flesh. Here's what God would look like if he, because that's what he did, who Jesus is. He's God in the flesh. So we get to know the character and nature, what love, we get to know what love is because we see it in him. We get to know what compassion looks like because we see it in him. We get to see what's important because we see it in him. We get to see what's not so important because we see it in him. Jesus revealed to us the character and nature of God. It's remarkable in that way. In fact, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3 says he's the exact representation of God. John in his gospel said he is the Word. Now, along those lines, yeah, you're whispering loudly back there. John 14, what did he say?
If you've seen me, you've seen God. You've seen the Father.
If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The Father and I are one, he says again and again and again throughout the Gospel of John. Now, in John chapter 1, the whole Gospel begins with, in the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and he did what? What? Eventually he will say that in John chapter 1 verse 14, but he starts out by saying, which corresponds to Genesis chapter 1,
All things were made through him.
all things were made through him. There is not one thing that's been made that was not made by him. What's he saying? He's God in the flesh. Okay? And there's power in him. Everything was created by him. Everything was created for him. He sustains all things. He is above everything. And in the last two verses, he says something significant for us personally. What does he say in the last two verses? Colossians 1, 19 and 20.
For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
All right. What did Jesus do?
He reconciled us.
He reconciled us. Again, relational term, reconciliation. Who needs to be reconciled? Well, everybody does, but when you get to a point where you need reconciliation, what has happened before that?
A break.
What?
A break.
There's been a break. Okay? There's been a break. Somehow you got separated. Somehow the relationship fell apart. Somehow you're not
Broken.
together.
Broken.
It's broken. Yeah. And Jesus reconciled. Jesus reconciled. Not your good deeds reconciled. Not your beliefs reconciled. Not being different reconciled. Jesus reconciled. Which has significance for all of us. Okay? So it's very interesting how he talks about the whole gamut of the character of Jesus, from that lowly, from the godness and giving that up, and his lowliness and servanthood and emptiness, to this creator, sustainer, who's the great reconciler. That's a lot of territory being covered there, right? Any other thoughts or questions before we go on?
Well, you said that he's the servant, the lowliest. He's God. Everything was made through him. So he's everywhere. He's in everything. He's readily, easily apparent if we look.
Isn't that what Paul said to the Athenians in Acts 17? He said, he's not far from each one of us.
Kind of like God saying that, there's plenty of evidence that I'm the creator. You just have to open your eyes and look.
Yeah.
You can't deny it.
Yeah. And Paul is presenting that case, remember, to a world much like ours, who says there are all kinds of gods, or there are no gods. Okay? It's a very similar world to ours in many ways. And he is making these definitive statements about the character of Jesus Christ. Unapologetically being definitive about who God is and who Jesus Christ is.
And as Christians, we don't understand how unique that is amongst world religions. The other world religions don't present a God that is knowable, even, that wants to be known, that loves. Judaism comes the closest, but no other religion has a God that came and lived among them and reconciled.
Yeah. Judaism has the same God. Muslims, it's not really the same God because they don't how they see Jesus Christ. But many other world religions talk about how you can become God, or I can become God. What a lousy God that would be. Okay? Right? That'd be lousy God. And so you'd have to be suspicious from the beginning of a religion that says you can be God. So Paul is elevating Christ to this proper place. So next question. Paul fulfilled what God told Ananias. Saul is my chosen servant to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings, as well as to the people of Israel. Acts 9:15. Now that you better know the character and work of Paul, read the following passages and tell what impact you think Paul had on these powerful leaders. Let me say before we read that first one in his interaction with Felix, one of the tremendous difficulties that we see, and you don't have to look far to find it, is for powerful and prideful people to submit to God, to submit to God. In fact, one of my teachers in my undergraduate work at Freed-Army College was F.W. Bradley. F.W. Bradley, for those of you who don't know, was the preacher who spoke at Elvis Presley's funeral. Elvis's father had become a Christian later, and FW had conversations with Elvis about his spiritual status. And I remember FW saying this about Elvis. He said he was so close to becoming a Christian, but he said he knew what he would have to give up. And apparently he wasn't willing. It's a hard thing. I mean, for me, somebody who's kind of lowly, it's not that hard to give up, because there's not that much to give up. But when we read of these leaders here, I want us to have a little bit of empathy for them, because I think Paul grabbed their attention, but I think each of them knew, if I follow this, what it's going to cost me, and we're willing to do that. Okay? So let's read it with those things in mind. Acts 23:24, and then chapter 24, verse 26 and 27. Somebody read those for us, please.
Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix, the governor.
Okay, so we're being introduced to Felix, and Paul is going to make his defense before Felix. Chapter 24, verses 26 and 27.
At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison.
Okay, so this is Felix being talked about as the one who did what? What would he do with Paul?
He visited with him often.
All right, he liked to have a conversation with Paul. Why do you think that was? Let me ask you differently. What impact do you think Paul had on Felix? Was he asked for him often? Now, one of the reasons he asked for him was what?
He wanted a bribe.
I want a bribe. Did he ever get one? No. So what impact do you think Paul had on Felix?
Verse 25 says Felix was alarmed after Paul talked.
What do you think that means? He was alarmed about what?
Apparently, he listened to what Paul said. He was concerned about judgment.
But he wasn't willing to give it up, what he had.
Well, he says, when I find it convenient,
Yeah.
I will send for you.
We sing a song sometimes, or many of us did in our earlier years. Almost persuaded. You know what's going on with Felix? So what do you think it was about Paul that made Felix almost persuaded?
Because of his doing all the time.
What? Same message every time, okay? I'm not changing the message, even though this is our 30th meeting. It hasn't changed.
I just think because it was because of his conviction.
What conviction?
He stood firm with the Lord, and he would not give in to anything to just get himself released.
All right. What had to impress Felix in the world in which he lived, where he was familiar with and kind of was accustomed to bribes, what he had to be impressed with is, this guy is not playing the game. He's a man of integrity. He is what he claims he is. And his message stayed the same. And so even though he was never, that we know of, converted, he had to go away thinking there's something real here. There's something real here. In a world of image management and deception, Paul and his message had to be unforgettable to Felix. Again, that didn't mean he obeyed, but it had to be unforgettable to him. All right? Next guy, King Agrippa. Acts 16, 19 through 23, and then 28 through 32. Somebody read those for us, please.
You mean 26?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's Acts 26, 19 through 23 first, and then verse 28 through 32.
So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem, in all Judea, and then into the Gentiles. I also preached that they should repent and turn to God and prove their repentance by their deeds. That is why the Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But I have had God's help to this very day, and so I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen in the Christ, and that Christ would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles.
All right, 28 through 32.
Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." The king rose, and with him the governor of and Bernice and those sitting with him. They left the room, and while talking with one another, they said, "This man is not going to do anything that deserves death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar."
I'm guessing that in every one of these exchanges between Paul and these powerful leaders, in the moment that Paul was talking with them, all of them were laid bare. And it made them very uncomfortable. What do you do? Because probably most of us in here have had moments like that. What do you do in moments like that? You want to jump back into an atmosphere that's more comfortable. You want to jump back to a world that's familiar to you, that reinforces what you have always lived by. And so I think Paul scared, back to the alarm, I think Paul scared every one of these guys. But they quickly jumped back into the world that they knew to push that aside. That's the story of so many people that have been almost persuaded. Yeah, I'll call for you when I want to hear from you. Okay? But right now, I've had encounters with people. I could name names of people that I could tell. I've had people leave angry at me. I've had people crying. I'll let you know if I want to say something. Okay? That's been the response. And the thing that we have to remember is there's a lot to give up. So what do you think the impact of Paul on Agrippa was?
I think that probably so many people, would appeal and try to convince, he's used criminals, convincing them for the criminal's interest. Hey, I really didn't do this, or I was a victim of that, or, they're always pleading on their own behalf. And Paul's concern was for him. And he's like, wait a minute, you're worried about my soul? And I think that authenticity probably came through and shook him a little bit.
Yeah. He's not defending himself. He's concerned that I'm not saved. That had to make an impact on him. It's remarkable. And the interesting thing about Agrippa that was different from the other Roman officials is that Agrippa was knowledgeable about the law. He had understanding about Judaism. So he knew that the things that Paul said fit with what the prophets had said. But where is he? Paul's in prison, but where is Agrippa? He's with all these dignitaries, these Roman officials. Can you imagine? He gives this, Paul, I don't know if it was sarcastic, I don't know if it was genuine. The Bible, this is where I wish we could see the scenes to know it for sure. So when he said, do you think in such a short time you can convince me to be a Christian? I don't know, if that was sarcastic or if that was genuine or what it was. But he knew what Paul was trying to do. That was clear. And so I'm going to guess that this is another leader that went away impressed by Paul, touched by Paul's genuineness and interest in his welfare.
It had to be such a strong message because here's Paul. They know he's a Roman citizen. They can tell he's obviously educated. They probably knew some of his history, that he was a Jew on the rise, and yet gave it up for, in their minds, what? And so the integrity and the message had to be just screaming at him.
Because probably all the men, Agrippa, this fits Agrippa most, he was probably the man of the least integrity. Because he knew, he had a Jewish background, and yet he was unwilling to give up all the perks and prestige and power and position like he saw in Paul.
But it had to resonate inside somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, the previous verse of Paul says to King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that none of this has escaped Agrippa's notice because it was not done in a corner.
Yeah.
He knows it.
He's getting close to him. I mean, he's getting right in there with Agrippa. And I know that Agrippa had to be made uncomfortable by that.
Sure.
But again, who's he around?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to look weak or foolish or anything in front of all the dignitaries.
Well,
So,
Festus was there and saying, Paul, you're out of your mind. You're so smart, you've lost your mind.
yeah, because that would be acceptable to the people around him. All right, we're about to run out of time. Let's quickly go to Caesar, chapter 27, 23, and 24.
Ask not an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me, and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.
All right, I'm guessing that the most powerful man in the world at the time, even he had to feel a little uneasy as Paul talked about the master of the universe. Now, it doesn't tell about Paul's exchange with Caesar. It just tells us he was going to have one. Okay, God was assuring that conversation would take place. So what do you think would have happened in that situation?
He probably was trying to teach you. Tell Caesar what he needed to hear.
There's no doubt Paul would do that. That's who he was. And so what do you think Caesar's reaction would have been to Paul?
Probably the same. What, you're trying to teach me what you believe? I'm the greatest man there is. You can't teach me.
But Caesar,
I'm a god.
exactly, Caesar regarded himself as God.
That's right. Caesars regarded themselves as gods. But there were moments he had to feel uneasy because of what Paul said. That the true God that Paul proclaimed. So, and then Publius is on the isle that they were shipwrecked on. He heard the powerful message, and it made them hospitable to Paul. So we don't know if he responded or not, but what I wonder in this is, do people see the integrity and boldness and authenticity and kindness in us as disciples of Jesus that we see in Paul? How people respond is out of our control. What we are and say is what we should focus on. Again, we have no evidence that any of these leaders ever said, that Jesus, I want to follow him. Okay? That didn't change Paul's message. It didn't change his approach. These were human beings who were needy, but they didn't see their need. So that brings us to the last question. I'm just going to skip to the last part. What from Paul's life do you plan to imitate more fully? What from Paul's life do you plan to imitate more fully? All right. A fearlessness, a boldness. Okay.
You mentioned a minute ago a couple of guys from the Sanhedrin that were converted or became followers of Jesus. And, in the same way, Paul, we don't know if these guys ever changed their heart, and probably didn't. But how many of those that were around the peripheral listening in on those conversations probably did? It would make sense they did, since the whole Roman Empire became a Christian, nation later. And, just the lesson to us is sometimes we focus in on this one thing. We think it didn't work and I didn't change anything. And yet there may be hundreds of people that we did change just by remaining, true to God in that one encounter that we thought was unproductive.
So since you said that, I'm gonna, integrity is one of the things that has always been important to me, and I want to live the integrity that Paul did. Several years ago, Daryl taught and baptized a couple, Terry and Moses Jackson. Terry Jackson and Moses. They had a little girl. I don't know how old she would have been then, probably 12, 14, somewhere in there, probably. Yes. Probably had no idea. Weren't thinking much about her at all, right? And so when I got a call a couple of months ago from Evan Jackson saying, I want you to baptize me. It started with work Daryl was doing with somebody else, who were their parents. And that, it bore fruit years later when she saw the need for Jesus Christ. So again, it just reminds us, don't close the book on what God may be doing for you. You may not see the end results of what you can see, but God may be working in other people's lives through what you're doing.
Both.
Philippians, he says from the household of Caesar, sends you greetings, so he apparently had some impact.
Well, and when we were studying Acts in Bible Study Fellowship last year, one of the people that was in my group, she had gone to this island where Publius was, and there are Christians on that island. They have churches of, who are believers on that island. And she said that was such a blessing to go there and see.
And it goes back to this, right?
Still there.
I'll give a real quick example. When J. Eddie Williams, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he taught at ACU and ACC back then. And he had preached some sermons that this man had heard. My dad had preached some sermons this man had heard. At his funeral, he said, it took me 40 years, but those sermons planted seeds. And finally, I became a Christian. And he said, it's because those two men planted seeds in my heart. It just took me a long time to get there.
If you're planting seeds, you never know where they're gonna come up. So just keep planting seeds. God bless you all.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.